Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. I'm so glad you could attend. This is the Classic English Literature Podcast, an idiosyncratic look at the transformative texts of English literature. Today, we continue our conversation about Ben Jonson, that great bear of the Jacobean stage and shameless self-promoter. Last time, we looked over two of his early comedies, when he was the great self-promoting bear of the Elizabethan stage, Every Man in His Humor and Every Man Out of His Humor, which set the template for not only Jonson's general approach to comedy, but for an entire subgenre, the comedy of humors, in which characters are driven by one dominant personality trait, a humor, roughly based on the Hippocratic theory of bodily fluids. That trait usually results in some comic undoing, at which we morally superior punters smirk complacently. I also said that I didn't think those plays were very funny. Maybe I should have clarified. I don't find the plays as texts very funny. In the hands of gifted performers and directors, one could certainly have a rollicking good time. The plays I want to discuss today certainly bear similarities to the humorous plays, but Jonson's writing feels less, derivative, especially of his classical models. Today's plays feel more English, I guess. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you of the new fan mail feature. On the episode's landing page, there's a button to send me a message. Let me know your thoughts, questions, or comments. Of course, I also have the regular email and the anti-social media, so love to hear from you. Give me a ring. Also, if you can, please click the Support the Show button to make a donation. Be honest with you, the company that hosts the podcast has had a policy change, and the unintended consequence of that seems to be that my monetization for ads has really dried up. So anything you can do to help would be deeply appreciated. Thank you so much. I said that I didn't find the early comedies funnies as texts, funny for the reader. And that's odd, given that Ben Jonson, more than any other writer of his age, was preternaturally conscious of himself as an author. Now that is, he had his eye not only on the immediacy of the stage, as did Shakespeare, but also on the world of publishing, and therefore on posterity. So to that end, he inaugurated one of the most influential acts in the history of literary publishing. In 1616, the very year Shakespeare died, the cause of whose death might even be some kind of seizure following a night of reckless excess with Ben Jonson, the latter writer published a folio called The Works of Benjamin Jonson. This other first folio is significant because the author includes his 9 plays and several court masques, not merely his poetry, as part of his works. And this gives the somewhat lowbrow medium of drama the same respect, status that one gave to verse. And of course, the elegant and expensive folio style elevates the status of the author too. Now, as I understand it, Ben did indeed take a lot of stick for this egregious self-promotion, but perhaps without such big-headedness, Hemmings and Condell would not have thought to commission Shakespeare's first folio, and all those plays would have been lost to us. The most significant plays from Jonson's folio are comedies. Volpone, or The Fox, from 1605, and The Alchemist, from 1610. Both similar in intention to the Every Man in and Out, which are also included, of course, but I think more deftly executed and less preachy feeling. Both plays satirize early 17th century London life, which Jonson sees as rife with a morally bankrupting ambition for wealth and status. So far, so familiar to the humorous comedies. But ideas inchoate in those plays, like the idea of human relations as entirely transactional, gullibility and self-deception, the idea of identity as performance, and the emptiness of social relations and institutions under such circumstances, are more fully fleshed out now. So let's take them in chronological order, and let's do the quick and dirty for Volpone. Volpone, a wealthy man, sans offspring, decides to play a trick upon 3 of his acquaintances, each of whom jockeys with the others to become his heir. He pretends to be deathly ill, prompting the 3 sycophants to lavish him with gifts to gain his favor and, of course, eventually his cash. Mosca, his servant, tells each contestant separately that they are the chosen one. First Voltore, then Corbaccio, then Corvino. He tells Corbaccio to go home, disinherit his own son Benario, and leave that legacy to Volpone, who will, no doubt, return the favor in his own testament. Now, Corvino, you should let your wife sleep in Volpone's bed. The old man's heart just couldn't take the strain. And then finally, Mosca suggests to Benario that his father intends to disinherit him, and promising to take him somewhere to witness his father's treachery. Now, meanwhile, back at the old sickbed, Lady Politic Would-Be talks so incessantly that Volpone fears for his actual health. Mosca says that Sir Politic is snogging a floozy in the gondola, and Lady Would-Be flies off in jealous pursuit. Then Mosca leads Benario behind a curtain so the young man can spy on his father. Now, we've seen plays like this before, and this has never gone badly, has it? Ta-da! Corvino arrives, and Mosca has to fob Benario off to deal privately with him now. But when Corvino leaves, Volpone leaps from his couch and attempts to force himself upon Mrs. Corvino, Celia, only to be saved by Benario. Corbaccio pops in to check if Volpone is still upright. Voltore demands an explanation. Mosca provides one. But we end up in court nonetheless. Mosca has Corvino and Corbaccio testify against Celia and Benario, and then presents Lady Would-Be, who obviously has been assured she is Volpone's heir. And after the trial, Volpone sends word that he is dead, and that Mosca shall inherit. Slowly it dawns on Voltore that Mosca always planned to keep the fortune for himself. Volpone, miraculously resurrected, testifies to the wretched behavior of Corbaccio, Corvino, and Voltore, and the court passes sentence on each. Okay, so we have learned a valuable lesson about greed, but without the nuance of Chaucer's Pardoner, let's say. We get the ironic/allegorical character names, but this time Jonson uses animal imagery, emphasizing the less-than-human attributes of the characters. Now, Volpone is Italian for fox, a creature notable for its slyness and cunning. Mosca is the fly, wallowing in decay and death. The 3 marks are all birds. We have Voltore, the vulture, a carrion feeder, an eater of the dead, right? Corbaccio is the crow, another symbol for death and an animal that feeds off corpses. And Corvino, the raven, more of the same, really. Benario means good-tempered or kind. Celia means heavenly. All of it feels quite medieval, doesn't it? Redolent of the bestiaries and the morality plays of centuries before. But let's think about this a little more, though, shall we? Readers may have noticed that Volpone's servant, Mosca, the fly, is sometimes referred to as a parasite. Hardly flattering, that, no? We know the word from biology, don't we, which came into the language around 1640. A parasite is an organism that deprives another of its nutrients. And while this is the main definition we have today, the way we use it today is actually applied in the life sciences as a metaphor for a usage that had crept into English the century before, in probably the 1530s. It literally means sponger or toady.
I'm Dan Heath. On the What It's Like to Be podcast, I ask folks about their jobs, like what keeps a TV meteorologist up at night.
When I'm at work and there's a tornado coming into town, my husband and my kids have to get into the tornado shelter without me.
What keeps a welder driven?
I never am satisfied. I always know I can do better.
And what keeps a hairstylist on her toes?
I know she likes that Holly Berry haircut, but she doesn't look like Holly Berry.
Find out on What It's Like to Be, wherever you get your podcasts.
Or actually even more literally, one who eats at another's table. It's from the Greek para, which means beside, and cytos, which means grain or food, something like that. So, are not all the characters of this play parasitical, or even polyparasitical? Is that even a word? It is now. These are people who all feed off others, even off other parasites. Volpone is a social parasite, and Mosca feeds off him. And then we get the less literal parasites named for carrion birds. But the same socio-moral principle applies. Depriving others or taking advantage of the deprivation of others for one's own gain. But what about Sir Politic and Lady Woodby? Now these names they're a bit more in the Johnsonian idiom, don't you think? Less bestial, and they're very like the names in the Everyman In and Out plays. I think it's their presence in the subplot, which actually has been dismissed by some critics, that makes Volpone a more morally or politically complex play than the earlier ones. They function as avatars of a type of social organization that appears thriving, but is, in fact, quite moribund. Let me see if I can tell you why. It's a little naughtier than it might first appear. Not at all like the animal images for the many other characters, which are pretty clear. So let's start with the word politic. In the 17th century, it certainly meant what we think it means, pertaining to the governing of a state or a people, public affairs, right? And it had also begun to take on a sense that seems to be falling out of common usage now, but you can still find it around. That is like meaning prudent or cautious. That was a politic choice. Finally, we can read the word as meaning worldly wise, shrewd or astute. And here is where Jonson puts his primary ironic use, because Sir Politic is daftly gullible. Right, but it's also about as funny as calling a tall guy tiny. But it does sort of hollow out any faith one might have in a prudent, sophisticated governance or justice. Which leads me to their hyphenated surname, Woodby. Now, I'm going to get pretty wordy-nerdy here, and I probably won't need all this for the point I'm making, but I just can't help myself. So grammatically, would-be, it's a phrase combining a modal or auxiliary verb, would, with an infinitive, to be. Now, there are at least 4 syntactical constructions deploying such a verb phrase. You've got future in the past. In that case, such a modal construction indicates an action that was expected to happen in the future from a past perspective. So, for example, you might say, well, she said she would be here by noon. Okay? You can also have conditional sentences, which express hypothetical or not real situations. So, for example, if I were rich, I would be happy. And then there's the ever wonderful subjunctive mood, which helps to express wishes or suggestions or demands, like, it is important that he would be on time. And then finally, We can use it in polite or tentative statements, used to make requests or suggestions sound a bit more polite or less direct, maybe more politic. So, for example, would you be so kind as to help me? Now, notable in all of these is the conspicuous absence of tactile reality. These utterances do not in any way state facts or evaluate things as they are. These are only at best anticipatory, at worst fantastical. And so as such, we get a more substantial thematic case for the importance of Sir Paul as a foil for Volpone. Let's look at Sir Paul's first speech in the play. Sir, to a wise man, all the world's his soil. It is not Italy, nor France, nor Europe that must bound me, if my fates call me forth. Yet I protest it is no salt desire of seeing countries, shifting a religion, nor any disaffection to the state where I was bred, and unto which I owe my dearest plots, hath brought me out. Much less that idle, antique, stale, grey-headed project of knowing men's minds and manners with Ulysses, but a peculiar humour of my wife's laid for this height of Venice. So the politic would-bes are the nobility abroad. He asserts his patriotism and religious faith, and actually his utter lack of curiosity about the world. So we've got a bit of like the stock stage bluff old English knight. He's the kind of guy who'd order roast beef and mashed potatoes at an upscale ristorante. It's worth noting, too, that knighthood itself is somewhat parasitic. The would-bes have purchased their nobility, their honor, just as Shakespeare had, remember, by the by? So they're not, as it were, to the manor born. So off they go abroad looking for other hosts from which to sponge. Which brings me back to that issue of the moribund social system. The would-bes are a sort of hollow nobility, one with all the pomp and circumstance, but none of the authenticity or pedigree, all fur coat and no knickers. My more Marxist-friendly listeners will say that all aristocracy is hollow parasitism. Touché, comrade, touché. I'll not challenge you here. But in terms of this comedy, there does seem to be a line drawn between the genuine article, even if in some platonic form, and the pawn shop knockoff. Now, what is that genuine article? In a word, honor. A mere scutcheon. Now, yes, Falstaff. That's what Jonson's getting at here. Honor has a bunch of meanings in this play. First that of political nobility, aristocracy, title. The would-bes have literally purchased honor. It also means here female chastity or purity. So when Corvino tries to pimp his wife Celia for Volpone's wealth, he is gambling with her honor. Celia laments, "O God and his good angels, whither is shame-fled human breasts, that with such ease men dare put off your honors and their own? Is that which ever was a cause of life now placed beneath the basest circumstance, and modesty and exile made for money?" And, of course, we have honor meaning esteem, respect, dignity. And this meaning, of course, much like the connotations of would-be, has no tactile or real meaning in the society of the play. Corvino demands that Celia, quote, "respect my venture," that is, his scheme. Celia replies, quote, "Before your honor?" She's exasperated, right? And he retorts, "Honor, tut, a breath. There's no such thing in nature, a mere term invented to awe fools." I wonder if Ben had seen Falstaff in Shakespeare's Henry IV, because it's pretty much the same indictment. almost seems that the idea of honor, integrity, is as theatrical and instrumental as the costumes and the plots and the deceptions. The world, as depicted in this play, is no compassionate society, no kingdom of heaven, but rather a base competition among parasites. Mosca has a little disquisition on the scrabbling, laboring parasite versus the one, quote, dropped from above, the natural-born, true parasite of excellent nature. And do note his rather cynical use of the word wise here. Not the wisdom of the sage, but the cunning of the confidence man. He says, quote, almost all the wise world is little else in nature but parasites, or subparasites. I suppose one could argue, especially if one is trying to segue smoothly to another subject, as here I struggle to, that Volpone's hollowing out of traditional virtues like honor and wisdom and charity by an ethic of predation is a form of negative alchemy, of decadent transformation. Another tip of my hat to my Marxist comrades. One could also argue that Jonson attacks the rise of a merchant capitalist society, one that feeds all human endeavor and experience into the maw of the market, where even virtue is commodified. But this too is a form of alchemy, turning gold into lead. What do you mean? What is this alchemy of which you speak, old man? Well, it's a practice that goes deep into the past and was part of nearly every culture from which we have records, actually. But in late medieval and early modern Europe, alchemy, a precursor to modern chemistry, combined elements of science and philosophy and mysticism. Alchemists sought to understand and manipulate the natural world, aiming to transform base metals into noble ones, such as turning lead into gold, right? That's the famous philosopher's stone you've heard tell of. And also to discover the elixir of life, which would grant immortality or perfect health. This period saw alchemy evolve significantly, influenced by the Renaissance revival of classical texts and the emergence of new scientific methods. Alchemists like Paracelsus and even the famed chemist Robert Boyle played crucial roles in this transition, moving the practice from its mystical and esoteric roots toward a more empirical and experimental approach. Now, lest we think that such a pursuit of pure knowledge was only motivated by intentions as noble as their transmuted metals, I feel bound to point out that there were some charlatans, mountebanks, dissemblers, who pursued the philosopher's stone for their own base motives. I'll pause to let you recover from the shock. Now, as serendipity would have it, Ben Jonson wrote a play called The Alchemist, which fits nicely with our preceding thesis about predation and commodified human relationships. Yes, it's time for another quick and dirty. The play is set in London and follows the exploits of three con artists who take advantage of the city's temporary state of chaos due to another visit from Mr. Plague. Lovewit, a gentleman, leaves his London house in the care of his servant, Jeremy, so he can escape the plague. But Jeremy, sensing an opportunity to make some money, hooks up with two other swindlers, Subtle, a con man posing as an alchemist, and Doll Common, a prostitute. Together, using Lovewit's house as their base of operations, they run an elaborate scheme to deceive various gullible victims by promising them wealth, power, and success through alchemy and other tricks. So bring on the marks. We've got Dapper, a clerk wishing to be an ace gambler. They convince him that he is related to the Queen of Fairy, so riches and luck are assured. And then there's Abel Drugger, a tobacconist who's told that by arranging his shop according to astrological principles, a bit of Jacobean feng shui, it will prosper. Sir Epicure Mammon obsesses about the Philosopher's Stone and its powers to grant him eternal life and limitless wealth. And Jonson also loves to mock the Puritans, doesn't he? So we get Tribulation Wholesome and Ananias, who seek the Philosopher's Stone to fund their religious cause. And then we've got Castrol, a country fellow who wants to swing big in the city, along with his widowed sister, the wonderfully named Dame Pliant, and she becomes a target for marriage by the con artists. As the play moves along, the schemes become increasingly complicated and chaotic. They juggle their victims, teeter on the edge of exposure, but they manage to keep the cons running. Now, Lovewit unexpectedly returns home. Hands up, who saw that coming? Yep. Now, Jeremy, as the trickster face, tries to explain the chaos away. Lovewit quickly realizes what's been happening, but instead of punishing the miscreants, he decides to calm the con artists. He marries Dame Pliant, benefiting from the schemes and forgiving Face in exchange for his loyalty. I've talked before about Jonson's fealty to the dramatic unities, remember those of action, time, and place, and this play really doubles down. In fact, the play premiered not in London but in Oxford, as the King's men were forced to tour because of the plague. The fictive date of the play's events is November 1st, 1610, which may very well be the date of the Oxford premiere. So that's keeping it real. When they do play it in London, they do it at the Blackfriars Theatre, the very district in which the story is set. So, if you'll indulge me a bit, the theatre itself, and the play being performed almost in real time and on site, is a bit of alchemy too, a transformation of reality. Surly says, quote, "Alchemy is a pretty kind of game, somewhat like tricks of the cards, to cheat a man with charming." Now, the adjective pretty in this line relies upon its old Germanic root meaning trick or something cunning and artful. And the word charming obviously evokes something magical, like a spell, from its root meaning to sing. And there's certainly a metadramatic element to this play, right? Some have noted that the ending of the play feels undeservedly happy, but Globe Theatre project director Andrew Gurr posits that in the meta space of the play, Lovewit, who gets all the money and the girl in return for protecting Jeremy/Face, is actually a projection of Shakespeare himself, who uses a kind of alchemy in the theatrical performance to trick the gullible audience, through the suspension of their disbelief, out of their money at the box office, right? Face, Subtle, and Doll are performing as alchemists or religious fanatics or whatever serves their venal purposes. And we're charmed by their pretty devices, not only within the narrative, but without as we enjoy a day at the theater. When Subtle babbles about his alchemical process, saying, quote, "It is of the one part a humid exhalation which we call materia liquida, or the unctuous water. On the other part, a certain crass and vicious portion of earth, both which concorporate do make the elementary matter of gold, which is not yet propria materia, but common to all metals and all stones. For where it is forsaken of that moisture and hath more dryness, it becomes a stone. Where it retains more of the humid fatness, it turns to sulfur or to quicksilver, who are the parents of all other metals." Subtle is speaking utter nonsense, though it is based somewhat in the work of Paracelsus, the Swiss alchemist and philosopher. Subtle knows enough to convince those who know nothing. But then, think about it. What's the line between the arcane and the absurd? Often it's the hearer's gullibility, right? And that, often enough, rests upon what one wants to believe. For the con artist, identifying the mark's self-image nearly guarantees success. Sir Epicure Mammon is an almost allegorical figure for gullibility, and, I suspect, something of a shadow of Shakespeare's character Falstaff. He seems almost a narcissistic psychopath, firmly convinced of his own virility and prowess, convinced the philosopher's stone will bring him untold wealth. That wealth will be spent bribing priests and poets to flatter him, and bribing husbands and parents to sell their wives and children to him for his sexual pleasure. Quote, "Where I spy a wealthy citizen or rich lawyer have a sublimed pure wife, unto that fellow I'll send £1,000 to be my cuckold." We needn't go over here, I don't think, the obvious commodification of humans and human relationships in Mammon's attitude. It's notable, though, that he doesn't merely intend to cuckold husbands, but to make them his possessions, right? He says, quote, "my cuckold." So I think The Alchemist goes further than Volpone in its critique because while both mock greed's debasement of human relationships, The Alchemist shows religion itself, perhaps even faith, as not only hypocrisy, given the actions of the characters, but as a pretty kind of game, a card trick, the opium of the people, so to speak. As we saw above, Surly is somewhat skeptical of Subtle's claims, but Mammon insists he can, quote, "show you a book where Moses and his sister and Solomon have written of the art, aye, and a treatise penned by Adam, of the philosopher's stone, and in High Dutch, which proves it was the primitive tongue." I do like the idea of Adam speaking Dutch, and the joke at the expense of England's trade rivals. That's pretty good. But the literary point here is that religious authority is mangled and repurposed for the project of deception. And without authority, of course, all may be said to be true. All may be permitted. And we see this in our own world, don't we? The world we live in, a society of media silos and deep fakes and competing realities and alternative facts. We are primed for our AI overlords. Well, that was an ominous way to end discussion of what are supposed to be comedies. But I suppose that the comedies that work, the ones that last, that continue to have some bearing on our lives, often touch upon the dark fears and grave concerns we cannot articulate otherwise. And of course, that which we mock is less to be feared, though not the less to be regarded. Before we go, I would like to draw your attention to my maturity in this episode, especially concerning The Alchemist. It is a play, and the only one I know of, actually, that opens with a fart. Subtle farts at face in line 2. I'll let you unpack the ironies there. You should note that I made no childish jokes, nor indulged in cheap sound effects for equally cheap laughs. Indeed, I thought it best, for both scholarship and decorum, to entirely overlook the somewhat distasteful opening to the play and avoid any charges of juvenile prurience. After all, this podcast has quite a reputation to uphold.